They said weight was the only thing that mattered, not the eyes, not the shape of the body, not the tremor of fear in a chest when the machine scanned through the cages. The auctioneers wore white coats with numbers stitched across the breast, their faces hidden by masks and visors, their voices flat as they called out measurements. The creatures lined up in rows were not given names, not even species, only codes stamped on tags clipped to their ears or pressed into their skin with burning brands. The vast warehouse smelled of metal and antiseptic, a cold, hollow stink that erased any trace of the lives that had been lived before arrival. Conveyor belts carried cages forward in an endless rhythm, scales sinking under the weight of bodies, screens flickering as numbers appeared. The workers scribbled the weight down, each figure matched with a destination. This one to the protein vats, that one to the tanneries, another for live dissection. Some of them cried, but quietly because loudness brought the prod, and the prod left burns that never healed. Among the rows was one who kept her gaze on the floor, her arms curled tight around herself as though she could shrink small enough to vanish. She had learned silence in the camps long before being moved to this place, but silence did not make her invisible. The numbers were still called out. Her body was still weighed. Her flesh was still listed for parts. At the far end of the line, where cages gave way to pens with transparent walls, stood the buyers, some human, some not. They carried digital slates, the glow of greed in their eyes brighter than the light overhead. They did not see lives, only commodities. The voice of the auctioneer droned like a machine, calling out kilos, setting prices, approving bids. It was the sound of inevitability, and for those waiting to be sold, hope was something so faint it was almost superstition. No one came here to be saved. They came here to vanish. But in the corner of the buyer's gallery, sitting apart from the crowd, was one man who did not hold a slate, who did not lean forward with the same sharp hunger as the others. He looked uncomfortable in the harsh light, his hands folded in his lap, his gaze restless. He had not intended to be here. He had followed a friend to this place, curious to see the inner workings of a system everyone knew about but rarely witnessed. He had told himself he was only observing. He told himself he was stronger than the pity that might surface. Yet when his eyes wandered across the rows of bodies, he felt a tightness in his chest that refused to ease. The girl, or perhaps she was not entirely a girl but something other, with faint ridges along her temples and pale skin that shimmered faintly under the sterile lamps, was pushed forward on the conveyor until her cage locked into place on the weighing platform. Her weight was called 54 kilos, barely enough to interest most buyers. Someone muttered about underfed stock, not worth the cost of transport. The auctioneer adjusted the price downward. She kept her eyes on the floor, waiting for the call that would seal her end. The man in the corner felt something stir in him, a recognition he could not explain. It wasn't attraction, not even sympathy in the usual sense, but a sharp jolt like memory, though he was certain he had never seen her before. He shifted in his seat, telling himself it was ridiculous, telling himself that nothing he did could matter. Yet when her number was repeated and the silence of disinterest settled across the buyers, a strange heat pushed up his throat. Without meaning to, he spoke. His voice cracked against the sterile silence. "I'll take her." Heads turned. The auctioneer's visor tilted toward him. The buyers frowned, irritated at the interruption of procedure. The man swallowed, but his voice steadied. "I'll take her," he repeated louder this time so there was no mistaking. The auctioneer hesitated, then entered the code into the slate, tapping in the man's identification when the scanners confirmed his presence. There was no argument. The system existed to sell, and if someone was willing to buy, the process continued. Yet the unease in the room thickened. No one bought single stock. No one bought without purpose. Still, the number flashed across the screen, the transaction sealed. The man stood, his heart pounding, realizing only now what he had done. The girl lifted her head at last. Her eyes were wide, disbelieving, searching the crowd to find the source of the voice that had disrupted the rhythm of doom. When her gaze found him, she did not know his name, did not know why he had spoken, but she clung to the possibility as though it were air after drowning. The guards moved to unseal the cage, their movements mechanical, but she resisted stepping forward, too afraid it was a trick, too afraid the cruelty would snap back and punish her for even imagining escape. The man approached, each step heavier than the last. He could hear his friend hissing at him from the row behind. "What are you doing? Are you insane? You can't just take one of them home." He ignored the voice, ignored the logic screaming in his skull. When the cage door swung open, he extended his hand, not sure if she would understand the gesture, not sure if she even had the strength left to take it. For a long moment, the warehouse seemed to hold its breath. The hum of machinery quieted in his ears. All he could see was her hand, trembling, hovering in the air before it finally, cautiously, settled into his. Her fingers were thin, cold, yet alive. The touch shocked him, not because it was strange but because it was human, profoundly human, as though the weight of the entire line of silent bodies had poured into this single contact. He helped her step down from the cage, her legs shaky, her shoulders hunched as though expecting a blow. No one stopped them. The auctioneer had been paid. The buyers had already turned their attention to the next lot. The system had no space for questions once the transaction was complete. And so, without ceremony, without resistance, he led her out. The doors closed behind them, cutting off the sterile light, cutting off the numbers and the smell of metal and antiseptic. Outside, the air was sharp with rain, the city sprawled in restless lights. She blinked at the open world as if she had never seen it before, and perhaps she hadn't, not since she was taken. He still had no idea what he would do, how he would explain this to anyone, how he would live with the consequences. All he knew was that when she looked at him, there was no calculation of weight, no number scrawled on a ledger. There was only the question trembling in her eyes, the question he had already answered with his voice. He tightened his hand around hers and whispered the words again, this time only for her. "Come home with me." The walk back to his apartment felt like a dream that might shatter at any moment if he dared to breathe too deeply. The streets were slick with rain, neon lights bleeding across puddles, traffic hissing in the distance. He kept his hood low, his hand never leaving hers, not gripping too tightly in case she startled, not loosening because he feared she might vanish into the crowd. She moved beside him in silence, her steps uneven, her bare feet splashing in the water, though she did not complain or resist. She had been trained too thoroughly to resist. He glanced at her now and then, catching the way her eyes darted to every sound, every passing vehicle. Every figure on the sidewalk, like a hunted animal still waiting for the trap to snap closed. He wanted to tell her she was safe, but the words caught in his throat, heavy with the knowledge that safety was a fragile thing and he had no guarantee to offer. He had acted on impulse, a single reckless spark in a place built to extinguish such things, and now he carried the weight of that decision with each step. By the time they reached the tower block where he lived, the city had sunk into a restless hum of night, lights still burning in endless rows of windows. He ushered her quickly through the sliding doors, past the lobby where the old attendant barely lifted his head, into the lift that groaned and shuddered as it carried them upward. She pressed herself into the corner, her thin arms wrapped around her chest, her gaze fixed on the glowing numbers climbing higher. When the doors opened, he guided her down a dim corridor that smelled faintly of dust and old wiring. His apartment was small, barely 2 rooms and a kitchen carved out of a narrow space, but it was warm and quiet, a world away from the sterile cruelty of the auction hall. He switched on the light, hesitating as she froze in the doorway, unwilling to cross the threshold. He turned back, softening his voice though he barely recognized the gentleness in it. "It's all right. You can come in." She stepped inside as though entering a place forbidden, her movements careful, her eyes roaming over every object. The worn sofa, the cluttered shelves, the table stacked with books and half-finished work files. She reached out, almost in disbelief, to touch the edge of the fabric draped across the couch, her fingers brushing the softness with a reverence that made his chest ache. He realized she might not have touched anything that wasn't metal or plastic in years. He gestured toward the chair, but she remained standing, uncertain. He moved to the kitchen, rummaging through cupboards, pulling out food though he had no idea what she could eat, what her body could handle. He settled on bread and fruit, placing them carefully on the table. She watched every movement, her gaze sharp with suspicion, but when he sat down and took a bite first, she approached slowly, her hands trembling as she lifted a piece to her lips. The moment the flavor touched her tongue, her eyes widened as though she could not believe it was real, and she ate in cautious, desperate bites, pausing after each one as though expecting it to be snatched away. He forced himself not to stare, but it was difficult. Every detail of her seemed etched into his mind, the faint shimmer of her skin under the light, the ridges at her temples that marked her as not entirely human, the way her shoulders hunched as though she were always preparing for pain. He realized he knew nothing about her. Not even her name. He cleared his throat, speaking softly. "Do you have a name?" She looked at him, confused as if the question was foreign. Then she whispered something barely audible, syllables strange and broken, not designed for his language. He tried to repeat it, clumsy and awkward, and to his surprise she gave the faintest flicker of a smile, the first he had seen. It lasted only a heartbeat, but it lit the room more than any lamp could. As the night deepened, exhaustion pulled at her. He offered the bed, insisting he could take the couch, but she hesitated, unwilling to separate herself from the one person who had disrupted the rhythm of death on her behalf. In the end, she curled on the edge of the bed, still tense, her eyes half open as if ready to flee. He lay awake on the couch, staring at the ceiling, thoughts racing. He wondered what he had done, what laws he had broken, what authorities might come knocking at his door. Creatures like her were not meant to vanish from the system. Records existed, transfers logged. Someone would notice. But as he listened to the faint sound of her breathing from the other room, he knew he would not undo his choice. Something in her eyes had tethered itself to him, something wordless yet undeniable, and no fear of consequence could sever it. Morning brought pale light through the blinds, the city already alive with its endless noise. He found her standing by the window, her hands pressed against the glass, watching the streets below with a hunger that made him realize she had not seen the outside world in far too long. He made coffee, the smell filling the room, and she turned, curious but wary. He placed a cup of water before her instead, and she accepted it with gratitude so raw it shamed him for every casual sip of his own life. He wanted to ask her questions, 1,000 of them, where she came from, what she had endured, how many others like her were still trapped. But he held back, sensing that the weight of words might crush her fragile steps toward trust. Instead he simply said, "You're safe here." It was a lie, he knew, but it was a promise he intended to fight to keep. Days began to form a rhythm, quiet and uncertain. He left food where she could reach it, gave her space, showed her how to use the shower, how to adjust the lights. Slowly the tension in her shoulders eased, though never fully. At night, he heard her whispering in her own tongue, fragments of a language that wrapped the room in an ache he couldn't understand. Once, when he dared to ask, she touched her chest and then her lips, shaking her head as if to say some things were not meant to be spoken yet. He respected the silence. But each time their eyes met, something passed between them, something that felt heavier than words. The world outside went on unaware, and for a brief while, it seemed possible that they might carve a hidden sanctuary within his small apartment. But shadows lingered in his thoughts, shadows of men in white coats and auctioneers with visors, shadows of numbers flashing across screens. He knew they would come eventually. He knew the system did not allow for anomalies. And he knew that when they came, he would have to decide all over again whether his reckless impulse could grow into something strong enough to fight back against the machinery of slaughter. For now, though, he let the moment breathe, watching her sit in the morning light, her hands wrapped around a simple cup of water, her gaze filled with something that looked dangerously close to hope. The third day after he brought her home was the first time she laughed, a small fragile sound that startled both of them. He had been fumbling in the kitchen, trying to show her how to slice fruit without mangling it, his clumsy hands slipping on the knife until a piece of apple flew across the counter and landed in his hair. He cursed softly, pulling it free, and when he looked up, she was covering her mouth, her shoulders shaking with something he had not imagined she was capable of. The laugh was thin, hesitant, as though she had forgotten how to make it, but it was real. For a moment the walls of the apartment dissolved, and he saw not a creature branded for slaughter but a being alive with humor, with something untouched beneath the scars. He grinned despite himself, tossing the piece of fruit at her gently. She caught it with a startled motion, her eyes widening, and then she bit into it, the laughter melting into quiet contentment. It was such a simple moment, yet it lit something in him that felt dangerous because it reminded him of how much there was to lose. That night, he dreamed of the auction hall again, the endless lines of cages, the voices droning numbers. Only this time every face in every cage was hers, eyes wide and desperate, repeating her faint laugh like a plea. He woke drenched in sweat, the city's sirens wailing faintly outside, and lay staring at the ceiling until dawn. When he rose, he found her sitting cross-legged on the bed, watching him with an expression he could not read, as if she sensed the shadows dragging at him. He wanted to tell her about the dream, but the words felt like poison in his mouth. Instead, he brought her breakfast, watching her eat with the same quiet reverence as before, and told himself the nightmares were his burden to bear, not hers. The fourth day was when he first noticed the system searching. On the news feeds that streamed across the public terminals, a brief notice scrolled beneath the endless chatter of politics and market prices. Processing error at district facility, 1 unit missing, under investigation. The words were plain, clinical, as if it were no more significant than a shipment gone astray. But his chest tightened and he shut the terminal quickly, his palms sweating. She was sitting nearby, tracing the lines of a book he had given her, her lips moving softly as she tried to echo the words, unaware of the danger growing outside their door. He forced a smile, but inside he knew the countdown had already begun. The system did not forgive anomalies. They would be hunting already, tracing every transaction, every identification number. His purchase had been recorded. His face had been scanned. It was only a matter of time before someone came knocking. That evening, he sat across from her at the table, watching her struggle with a fork, her brow furrowed in concentration as she tried to master the tool. He should have been teaching her, encouraging her, but instead he asked, his voice tight, "Do you understand what happens if they find you here?" She froze, the fork slipping from her fingers, her eyes locking onto his with sudden alarm. He had not spoken of it until now, not wanted to tarnish the fragile peace. But it felt cruel to leave her ignorant. He sighed, rubbing his temples, and tried again, softer this time. "They'll come for you. They'll take you back. I don't know if I can stop them." Her lips parted as though to speak, but no sound came. Then slowly she reached across the table, her hand settling on his. The gesture was tentative but steady, and the look in her eyes was not fear but trust. It was the trust of someone who had already lost everything and yet was willing to risk the last fragile thing she had been given. He swallowed hard, pressing his hand over hers, silently promising he would not let them touch her again. The days that followed were a tightrope of fear and fragile intimacy. She grew bolder in small ways, venturing to the window more often, daring to ask for words in his language, mimicking his gestures until her speech was a patchwork of broken sentences that still carried meaning. Once she pointed to herself and spoke her name again, slower this time, guiding his tongue until he managed to shape the syllables with more grace. When he said it properly, her eyes lit with a glow that almost erased the scars, and for the first time she spoke his name back to him, clumsy but determined. It felt like the beginning of a bond deeper than words, something that stitched across the silence like thread pulling two torn fabrics together. But the shadows outside kept creeping closer. He noticed patrols more often in the streets, black uniformed figures moving in pairs, scanning alleys, questioning passers-by. He avoided eye contact, kept his hood low, his heart thudding each time they passed. One night as he returned with food, he found a notice plastered to the wall near the building's entrance. A grainy image of her face, distorted from the auction hall scans, labeled with numbers and warnings. Property of District Processing, missing stock. Report immediately. His hands shook as he tore it down, stuffing it into his pocket before anyone else could see. By the time he reached the apartment, his mind was already racing with possibilities. How long before someone recognized her, how long before the door burst open? She was sitting in the dim light, waiting, her eyes softening when she saw his expression. He wanted to hide it, to keep the fear from spilling into their fragile sanctuary, but when he sat beside her, the words tumbled out in a whisper. "They're hunting for you." She did not flinch. Instead, she reached up and touched the side of his face, her fingers cool against his skin, her gaze steady. She spoke something in her language, low and melodic, words he could not understand but that carried the weight of comfort. He leaned into the touch, closing his eyes, and for a moment the fear eased, replaced by the strange calm of knowing they were no longer alone in their struggle. When he opened his eyes, she was still watching him, and he realized she was no longer merely surviving in his apartment. She was beginning to live. And that made her more dangerous to the system than ever. That night he stayed awake long after she slept, staring out the window at the city sprawled in restless light. He knew the walls were closing in. He knew impulse had carried him this far, but impulse would not be enough to protect her when the knock came at the door. He needed a plan, something more than hiding in the shadows of a tower block. As he watched the patrols moving like insects far below, an idea began to take root, reckless and desperate, but perhaps their only chance. If the system was built to erase lives by the kilo, then maybe the only way to save hers was to step outside the system entirely, to vanish into the cracks where numbers could not reach. He did not yet know how, but as he looked back at her sleeping form, curled in the sheets with her lips still curved faintly in the memory of laughter, he swore he would find a way. The first sign came sooner than he had expected. 3 nights after he saw her face on the notice, there was a sound in the hall, a heavy thud of boots against the floor, the faint crackle of radios whispering through static. He froze, his heart hammering in his chest, and motioned for her to stay silent. She obeyed instantly, shrinking into the shadows of the room, her body folding in on itself as if she could vanish into the walls. The footsteps stopped outside his door. He held his breath. Knuckles rapped against the metal, firm, official. "Routine check," a voice barked, clipped and cold. His pulse thudded in his ears, and for one terrifying second he thought about not answering at all, but silence would only sharpen suspicion. He forced his legs to move, forced his face into weary irritation as he opened the door. Two uniformed enforcers stood there, visors reflecting the dim light, scanners strapped to their wrists. "We're confirming resident identification," one said flatly. He nodded, offering his ID chip, his hands trembling despite his effort to appear calm. The scanner beeped, green light flashing, and the officer barely glanced at him before moving to peer down the hall. "You live alone?" The question was routine, casual, but his throat went dry. He forced a shrug. "Yeah. No one visits." They looked at him for a long moment, and then the other officer grunted, turning away. "Stay inside after curfew." He shut the door, locking it with shaking hands, his body collapsing against the wall as the footsteps faded down the hall. She emerged slowly from the shadows, her eyes wide, her lips pressed tightly together. He crossed the room to her, grabbing her shoulders, speaking in a whisper harsh with urgency. "We can't stay here. They'll be back, and next time they won't leave." She nodded, her silence filled with an understanding that required no words. He knew then that hesitation was over. The fragile peace of hiding in his apartment had ended. Now they had to move. He spent the night pacing, pulling out old maps, accessing hidden corners of the city network he hadn't touched in years. He had once been reckless in his youth, dabbling in underground circuits, places where IDs could be burned, faces erased, new lives forged in shadows. He had left it behind when he decided to live quietly, but now he needed every connection he had buried. The risk was enormous, but it was the only way. By dawn, the plan was rough but real. There was a smuggler's route through the old subway lines, tunnels long abandoned and sealed off by the authorities but still used by those who trafficked goods and people the system wanted erased. If they could reach the lower levels unnoticed, they might find someone willing to move them beyond the city, into the outlands where scanners were rare and patrols weaker. It was dangerous, full of betrayal and exploitation, but it was better than waiting for the inevitable knock. He explained as much as he could to her, sketching crude lines on the table with his finger, pointing to exits, miming the act of slipping past patrols. She watched him intently, her brow furrowed, and then touched his chest firmly with her hand. "Together," she said in broken syllables, her accent heavy but her meaning clear. He covered her hand with his own, nodding. The day crawled with tension. Every sound in the hall made his heart leap, every siren outside felt like a signal closing in on them. She spent the hours studying the few words he wrote on scraps of paper, repeating them softly, her determination almost painful to watch. He wanted to tell her she didn't need to learn, didn't need to fight so hard to fit into his world, but at the same time he knew it was her way of holding on to the hope he had given her. When night finally fell, he packed what little he could: food, water, a blanket, a small stash of credits he had saved. He gave her one of his old jackets, far too large for her, but it covered her ridges and shimmer well enough to pass in the dark. She pulled the hood low over her face, her fingers clutching the fabric as though it were armor. They slipped into the night like fugitives. The streets pulsed with neon and rain, the patrols thicker than before. He led her through alleys, down stairwells that stank of rot, across rooftops slick with water. Twice they had to freeze as searchlights swept across the buildings, his arm wrapped tightly around her as they pressed into shadows. Her breathing was shallow, but she never panicked, never pulled away. When they finally reached the rusted grate of an old subway entrance, he pried it open with shaking hands, ushering her into the darkness below. The tunnels smelled of damp and rust, the silence broken only by the drip of water and the scurrying of rats. He switched on a small lamp, guiding her through the maze of concrete and forgotten rails. Hours passed in the underground, each step pulling them further from the city above and deeper into the unknown. At last, they reached a hidden enclave, a cluster of flickering lights strung across the cavern, where figures moved in the shadows, their faces hardened by survival. Smugglers, runaways, outcasts, people who lived beyond the system's numbers. The leader, a broad man with scars across his scalp, stepped forward, eyeing them both with suspicion. "You bring trouble?" he growled. The man straightened, forcing confidence into his voice. "We can pay. We need safe passage." The smuggler's gaze lingered on her, narrowing with curiosity. "She's one of theirs." His lips curled. "They'll hunt you to the edges of the world for this." She shrank closer to him, her fingers tightening on his sleeve. He met the smuggler's eyes, steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. "Then we'll run that far." The smuggler studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "It won't be cheap." He handed over the credits without hesitation, his last safety net stripped away in a single exchange. The smuggler pocketed them, gesturing toward the far tunnels. "We move at dawn." Rest while you can. After that, there's no turning back. They found a corner near the wall, settling on the cold ground with the thin blanket wrapped around them. She leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder, her body trembling with exhaustion. He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close, and whispered into her hair, "We'll make it. I promise." She closed her eyes, her hand curling into his shirt, and for the first time since leaving the apartment, he felt her weight settle fully against him, no longer poised to flee. In the silence of the tunnels, surrounded by strangers and danger, the fragile bond between them solidified into something heavier, something undeniable. He realized then that it was no longer about impulse or guilt or even rescue. It was about her, entirely and irrevocably, and the life they might carve together if they could only outrun the system built to measure her by the kilo and end her by the blade. The days that followed tested both of them in ways they could never have anticipated, for though the creature was now safe in the boy's modest home, the world outside still moved with its relentless hunger, and news of something strange inevitably traveled quickly through a town where every rumor clung to the air like smoke. The boy tried to continue his life as if nothing had changed, waking in the mornings and walking to school, but all the while his mind lingered back in his room where the being waited, silent yet aware, pressed against the fragile walls of a world it did not understand. Every evening he hurried home, heart pounding with both dread and excitement, never knowing what new trial awaited him. Sometimes he would open the door to find the creature curled like a child in the corner, its luminous eyes following him with wordless trust, and other times he would return to chaos, broken lamps, claw marks across the wood, water spilled across the floor as if the being had wrestled with its own confusion. Yet even then, even in the destruction, he could sense that it was not rage or malice that drove those actions but a storm of fear, an echo of the place it had come from, where beings like it were nothing more than numbers stamped on scales and condemned to an ending they had no power to escape. The boy spoke to it constantly, his words tumbling out in awkward streams, hoping sound might bridge the abyss between species. He named it Soul, after the warmth of the sun that cut through his window, believing such a name might root it in a world that had offered little but cruelty until now. Soul responded in gestures rather than words, tilting its head when confused, lowering itself to the ground when ashamed of some unintended damage, and pressing its forehead lightly to his chest when gratitude overwhelmed it. These gestures grew into a language of their own, a rhythm of coexistence that felt more genuine than any conversation he had ever held with another person. Each day he snuck scraps of food home, carefully hiding them beneath his coat, feeding Soul under the cover of shadows. Each night he listened to the sounds it made, low hums that vibrated like music yet carried a sorrow so deep it seemed to seep into his bones. He began to dream of cages, of chains rattling in halls that smelled of metal and death, but also of hands reaching through the bars, pulling another from darkness into light. The boundary between his life and Soul's past blurred until he could no longer tell which belonged to whom, and in that blurring he realized that saving Soul had already changed him in ways he could not reverse. But safety was fragile and fragility rarely lasts. One afternoon, as he left school and hurried down the dusty road toward home, he noticed men gathered near the old slaughterhouse, their voices rising in agitation. He ducked behind a wall and listened. Someone had reported strange sounds in the night, animal cries that did not belong to any known species. Another swore they had seen footprints larger than a man's pressed deep into the earth near the boy's neighborhood. Fear spread quickly among them because anything unknown was always labeled a threat, and threats were meant to be destroyed. The boy's pulse raced as he slipped away, knowing that their suspicion might soon turn toward his house, that the sanctuary he had built could crumble with a single knock on the door. He returned home and found Soul waiting, unaware of the tightening noose, its eyes filled only with trust. He wanted to tell Soul everything, to confess the danger they both faced, but how could he explain to a creature that had only just escaped slaughter that safety itself might always be an illusion? He simply knelt, resting his forehead against Soul's, and whispered promises that his own fear made brittle. "I won't let them take you. Not now. Not ever." That night the boy scarcely slept, pacing the floor as shadows shifted across the walls. He planned escape routes in his mind, paths through the fields that might lead them away from town, away from eyes that measured worth in weight and flesh. Yet each plan collapsed beneath reality. He had no money, no supplies, nowhere to hide beyond a few nights. The world beyond the town was vast, filled with dangers he barely understood, and Soul, for all its resilience, still trembled at sudden noises, still recoiled at the sight of knives or chains. To leave meant risking discovery, starvation, perhaps capture by those who would not hesitate to return Soul to the fate it had narrowly avoided. To stay meant waiting for suspicion to find them. Both choices were prison doors swinging shut. Still, as dawn approached and the first birds called out, the boy looked at Soul sleeping in the corner, its chest rising and falling with fragile peace, and knew that hesitation was no longer an option. If he did nothing, the world would take Soul back. And so he resolved to act, to find a way forward, even if that path cut into wilderness, even if it demanded more than he thought he could give. When the first knock came 3 days later, his heart nearly broke. Heavy, insistent fists pounded against the door while voices barked his name, demanding entry. Soul startled awake, rising with a low hum that vibrated through the floor, its luminous gaze fixed on the sound. The boy pressed a hand against its chest, whispering for silence, for patience. He forced himself to open the door a crack, his face arranged in forced confusion. The men stood there, townsfolk armed with suspicion, led by a butcher whose eyes gleamed with cruelty honed over years of killing. They spoke of tracks, of rumors, of responsibility. They asked if he had seen anything unusual, if he had heard cries at night. He shook his head, forcing lies past a dry throat, claiming ignorance, claiming innocence. For a moment it seemed they might believe him, but then one man's gaze drifted past his shoulder into the dimness beyond, and the boy knew the fragile curtain between safety and discovery was about to fall. Panic surged through him, hot and blinding, but Soul moved before he could, stepping silently from the corner into the light. For an instant the men froze, confronted not by the monster their fear had conjured but by a being whose presence defied every word they had spoken. Soul stood tall yet unthreatening, its posture neither aggressive nor submissive, its eyes wide and shining with something closer to sorrow than menace. The silence stretched long, heavy with awe and disbelief, until the butcher snarled and raised his weapon. Instinct roared within the boy, louder than fear, louder than reason. He threw himself between them, arms spread, his voice cracking as he shouted, "No! You'll have to go through me first." The words hung in the air, reckless and impossible, yet truer than anything he had ever said. For in that moment he understood that Soul was no longer just a creature he had rescued, it was his family, his friend, his responsibility, and he would not surrender it to a world that measured life by the kilo and sentenced it to slaughter. The standoff trembled on the edge of violence, the butcher's weapon glinting, the boy's defiance burning, Soul's presence radiating a quiet dignity that no cage could contain. What would happen next? The choice of fight, flight, or miracle, hovered like lightning waiting to strike, and the boy knew that whatever the outcome, nothing in his life, in Soul's life, or in the life of the town itself would ever be the same again. The moment seemed to last forever, a knife edge of silence broken only by the rasp of breath and the faint hum that pulsed from Soul's chest, a sound that was neither human nor animal but something deeper, like the earth itself groaning in sorrow. The men outside shifted uneasily, their certainty shaken by the sight before them, for what they had imagined as a beast turned out to be something more fragile and mysterious than their imaginations had allowed. Yet fear is stubborn, and once planted it rarely withers. The butcher snarled louder, pressing forward, weapon raised with trembling fury, and the boy felt his knees weaken even as his arms spread wider, his body a shield he knew could never stop steel. His heart pounded so loudly he thought it might burst, but beneath the fear burned a fire fiercer than survival. The knowledge that Soul had trusted him, had followed him into this fragile sanctuary, had laid its life in his hands without demand or condition, and he would sooner be destroyed than betray that trust. He screamed words that tore his throat raw, words he had never spoken with such certainty in his life. "It's not a monster. It's alive. It's more than you'll ever understand." Soul moved then, not in violence but in grace, stepping forward with deliberate calm, lowering itself slightly so as not to tower over them, placing one long luminous hand gently on the boy's shoulder. The hum deepened, filling the air like invisible light, resonating in bones and blood until the men faltered, glancing at each other with fear that no longer came from anger but from awe. Something in that sound reminded them of nights long past, of lullabies hummed by mothers, of the rhythm of life before cruelty hardened their hearts. One of the men, the youngest, his weapon shaking, lowered his eyes as though ashamed. But the butcher's face twisted with rage, for he had no room for awe, only profit and pride. He lunged, weapon slashing through the space meant for Soul's chest, but the boy shoved forward, knocking the blow aside. Pain seared across his arm where the blade grazed him, but he did not fall.